Have you ever stopped and wondered why certain people show up in your life? Not just the obvious ones, not your family, not the people you've expected to meet. I'm talking about those friendships that seem to appear out of nowhere. The coworker who became a trusted friend, the mentor who arrived at exactly the right moment, the person who walked beside you through a difficult season and somehow changed your life without either of you realizing it at the time. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been around a while, welcome back. Go ahead and grab a cup of coffee, pull up a shop stool, settle in for a few minutes. Around here, we spend a lot of time talking about wood, faith, life, and the lesson God hides in ordinary things. Today started as a simple day in the shop. I've got a Hickory tabletop that's been, it's been banging around the shop for a while, and I've been working on it slowly, and it's finally beginning to come together. And I also had a piece of cedar that I hoped would survive long enough to become a bowl. And somewhere between the sanding wood and watching grain emerge beneath a coat of oil, I found myself thinking about friendship, God's sovereignty, and whether the people we meet are far less accidental than we imagine. So while we work on a tabletop and take a chance on another piece of cedar and see where the day leads, let's spend a little time talking about the people God places along our path and what they might reveal about the one who put them there. As I mentioned, today starts off with this piece of hickory. I loved it the moment I saw it, but it's been a challenge in a lot of ways. I've struggled with the epoxy to get it the right consistency. A couple of times that I have poured it, it didn't come out well and it didn't cure right, so I had to scrape it off and try again. But as you can see, I'm putting the oil on it now and getting it ready for its final journey. And this slab has really been one of those projects. I've been filling the voids with epoxy, and at this point, I'm just checking for flaws. I've already done the final bits of sanding, and today I was just ready to really get that oil on it and finish it up. If you've worked with hickory before, you know what happens. The moment the oil touches the wood, you can see the grain waking up. The colors begin to deepen, especially around that knot hole in the middle. And the character sort of comes alive. I've said this before, and I'll probably say it 100 times again at least, that it is one of my favorite moments in woodworking. You spend hours staring at something that looks ordinarily, and suddenly you get a glimpse of what it might become all along. As I worked on this slab, I found myself thinking about something completely different. I was thinking about friendship, relationships, the people that God has placed in our lives. I had a conversation this week with a friend of mine. His name is Jim Boyd. I've known Jim for probably 10, 12, I don't know, maybe 15 years now, and he's a church planter and trainer, and it's been amazing watching what God has done through his ministry. They've planted churches all over the place, East Coast, West Coast, Alaska, Canada. Recently, they sent people they've trained to places as different as India and Maine, of all places, which if you've ever looked on a map, it's quite a combination. But during our conversation, Jim said something that stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't complicated, and I don't even think it was profound, really. It just hit me so powerfully. It landed deep in my soul, and I couldn't quite get it out of my head. He talked about the idea that God is the initiator in all our relationships. Not just our salvation, not just our connection to heaven, not our ministry, but relationships, friendships, the people who walk beside us. And I realized that I've never really thought about that before. I think most of us assume that our friendships, they're part of us, things that we do. We meet somebody, we like them, we had things in common, we invested time, we built a relationship. And certainly we do play a role in all that, but I think Scripture paints a much bigger picture. If God is truly sovereign, then he is also sovereign over proximity. He's sovereign over timing. He's sovereign over who sits beside us in school, who becomes our coworker, who visits our church, who calls at exactly the right moment, who encourages us when we need it the most, who challenges us when we are becoming somebody we shouldn't be. Maybe those relationships weren't accidents at all. Maybe they're gifts. Maybe they were appointments. Maybe, just maybe, they were curated by the hand of God himself. One of those images that came to my mind was when Paul was leaving Ephesus. I think it's in Acts 20. And after years of ministry, Paul gathers the elders together, and he knows he probably won't see them again this side of heaven. And when it's time to leave, the scene is truly heartbreaking. They embrace him. They weep. They walk him to the ship. Nobody wants the moment to end. That passage has always fascinated me because it reminds me that spiritual maturity doesn't eliminate grief. I've had to leave before. I've had to leave churches and friends. I've moved across the country. I've moved across the world and back again. And it's always hard saying goodbye to the people that we've built relationship and friendships with. And it doesn't make it easy. For that, I think I understand Paul, and in a little way, I understand Jesus when he ascended into heaven. Now, I realize that, he's God and I'm not, and, he didn't really ever leave us. He just ascended to a different position and sent his spirit, which is a part of him. Somehow, don't fully understand the Trinity, but I do understand Paul. See, Paul loved those people, and those people loved Paul. The tears were not evidence of a weakness or a failure. They were evidence of something real that had been built between them. Sometimes we measure relationships on how long they last. Scripture often measures them by how deeply they mattered to us. One of the hardest things in ministry has been moving. As I mentioned, I've lived in different places, served different churches, worked in different schools, spent time overseas. And every move, I leave people behind. Current technology helps. Facebook has been very, very helpful in that. We can text, we can call, there's video chat. But distance does change things. A friend who lives 4,000 miles away is still your friend, but the relationship becomes different. And if I'm being honest, I've wrestled with that deeply. And I've asked questions like, why do some friends last decades and others fade? Why do some people talk with us for an entire lifetime while others only stay for a season? I don't have all the answers, but I do know this. Not every relationship is intended to serve the same purpose. Some people walk beside us for the journey. Others help us across a bridge. And some arrive at the exact moment that we need them the most. Here's an interesting idea that I've come across. See, researchers have been exploring this concept for years. Humans seem capable of maintaining only a limited number of meaningful relationships. The number is cited about 150 relationships. I don't know if that number is exact, and I don't know if that's true for every human being, but it isn't really the point. The point is that we are finite creatures. We cannot deeply know everyone. We cannot invest equally in everyone. And perhaps that limitation is part of God's design, because relationships require attention, presence, time, shared experiences. The very things that are becoming increasingly rare in our modern world. While I was thinking about all this, I started turning this piece of cedar. Now, if you've watched this channel for any amount of time, you know Cedar and I have a complicated relationship. Cedar has humbled me more often than I care to count. It's soft and it likes to crack. It likes to remind me that confidence and competence, they're not always the same thing. But this blank looked good. I didn't see any major defects or obvious cracks. It's a pretty solid piece of wood, and I was really looking forward to turning it. And as it began to spin, something beautiful started to really emerge out of it. I couldn't help but think just how much friendships are like that. When you first meet someone, you don't really know what's hidden beneath the surface. You don't know what joys they bring. You don't know what wounds they carry. You don't know whether they'll become a lifelong friend or simply someone who walks beside you for a short distance. All you know is that God has brought your paths together for that moment. And I think that's enough to begin with. The older I get, the more convinced I become that relationships are one of God's primary tools for shaping us. Some people encourage us, some challenge, some sharpen, some break our hearts, some teach us how to forgive. Some teach us how to trust. Some teach us how to trust again. But a few become such a part of our story that we can barely remember who we are before we met them. When I look back across my life, I can see fingerprints everywhere. Friends from childhood, fellow pastors, teachers, church members, missionaries, students, co-workers, family, people who appeared at exactly the right time. And most often it wasn't because I planned anything. It's not because I was clever enough to orchestrate those events. It happened simply because God was writing a story bigger than the one I can see. The Hickory slab wasn't really finished yet when I moved over to the Cedar blank. I know I still have work to do, but I wanted to get onto this because, the oil I put in there needed to dry. It needed to soak in. I'll probably put 2 or 3 more coats on before I put the polyurethane. And that means more coats, more waiting, more patience. The cedar bowl, on the other hand, I had every intention of reaching the finish line today. And it turned out better than I expected. One project remains unfinished. One reached a completion. And maybe that's a fitting picture for relationships too. Some friendships are complete chapters. Others are still being written. Some are memories. Others are still unfolding. But every one of them matters, and every one of them bears the fingerprints of a God who knew we were never meant to walk through life alone. You see this all through Scripture. One of the most remarkable friendships in the Bible is a friendship between David and Jonathan. On paper, it should never have happened. Jonathan was the son of King Saul. He was the heir to the throne. David was a shepherd boy whom God had chosen to replace his father, and really replace him. If anyone had reason to see David as a threat, well, it was Jonathan. Yet somehow God knit their hearts together. Scripture says that Jonathan loved David as his own soul. He encouraged him when he was afraid, protected him when his father's jealousy turned murderous, strengthened his faith when he was hiding in the wilderness. There were moments when David might have completely lost heart had Jonathan not shown up. And then there was Paul. We often think of Paul as this larger-than-life figure who carried the gospel across the Roman world, but even Paul rarely traveled alone. Sometimes it was Barnabas, the son of encouragement, who believed in him when all the others were still suspicious of his conversion. Later it was Silas singing hymns beside him in a prison cell. His young protege, Timothy, who became like a son in the faith to him. Luke, the gospel writer, traveled with him and carefully recorded much of what happened in his ministry. God could have accomplished his purposes without any of those relationships. But God chose not to. Instead, God wove those people together. He strengthened one believer through another. He reminded the lonely that they were never alone. And perhaps that's one of the reasons friendships matter so much. Relationships are not merely social conveniences. They're not a pathway to, build your brand or step up the corporate ladder. They're often one of God's chosen instruments of grace. Through them, He encourages us, corrects us, comforts us, sometimes carries us through seasons we would never have survived by ourselves. When I think about people who have shaped my own life, I realize that very few of the most important relationships were planned. Almost all of them arrived unexpectedly. Looking back now, I can see what I couldn't see then. God was already at work even before I knew their names. And this reflection just causes me to look back on my own journey. And I can see the people who stayed for decades, the people who walked with me for only a season, people who showed up at the exact moment that I needed them. Some became lifelong friends. Some became mentors. Some became lessons that I learned. All of them became part of the story. Not just my story, but His story through me. And maybe that's true for you as well. So before you rush off to the next thing today, take a moment to think about the people God has placed along your path. Maybe even reach out to one of them. Let them know they matter. You never know how much a simple phone call text message, or word of encouragement might mean. I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Tell me about a friendship that surprised you, encouraged you, maybe even changed your life. Some of the greatest friendships began in the most unexpected places. If these conversations around woodworking, faith, life, and lessons hidden in ordinary things have been helpful, I'd appreciate it if you'd like the video, subscribe to the channel, maybe share it with somebody who might need a little encouragement today. Every share helps. They help these conversations reach another person who may need to hear them. Well, my time in the shop is done. The project's over. I still have to work on that slab of hickory. But for now, this cedar bowl is finished. I hope you've enjoyed watching me turn it as much as I enjoyed turning it. I will say that the sapwood on the side and the beautiful reds and the swirling pattern of the grain, it really pops out. In fact, this one's going to be one that I'm going to remember for a very, very long time. Until next time, I encourage you to keep creating, keep learning, keep growing, and don't overlook the people God has placed along your path. As always, grace builds what grit sustains. I'll see you in the next one.